1095, Western Europe. To understand the storm that was about to break upon the Levant, we must first understand the two worlds that stood on the precipice of collision. They were not merely different in religion, but fundamentally different in their very soul, their structure, and their level of civilization. In the 11th century, Western Europe was a land of fractured shadows. It was a continent emerging from the long, dark aftermath of the Carolingian collapse, a patchwork of small, warring fiefdoms held together by a tenuous web of feudalism. This was a world of knights, peasants, and lords, a society defined by local loyalties and the constant, grinding friction of small-scale warfare. The political map was a chaotic mosaic of duchies and counties, where a king's power often ended at the edge of his own castle walls. Yet beneath this political fragmentation, a singular, powerful force provided the glue that held the West together, the Roman Catholic Church. In an era of profound instability, the papacy was the only institution that transcended borders. The Church was the arbiter of morality, the keeper of knowledge, and the ultimate authority on the salvation of the soul. For the common man and the high-born knight alike, life was viewed through a lens of eternal consequence. The world was a battlefield between divine grace and demonic temptation, and the struggle for the Holy Land was not just a territorial dispute, it was a cosmic necessity. Now turn your gaze eastward, across the Mediterranean, to a world of staggering contrast. While Europe struggled to find cohesion, the Islamic world was a realm of unparalleled sophistication, though it, too, was a house divided. At the dawn of the 11th century, the monolithic unity of the early caliphates had fractured. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had become a shadow of its former self, its political authority eclipsed by rising regional powers. In the West, the Fatimid Caliphate ruled Egypt and North Africa, championing Shia Islam and controlling the vital trade routes of the Red Sea. In the East, the Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppes, were surging into the heart of the Islamic world. These were not merely conquerors, they were a transformative force. The Seljuks were Sunnis, and as they swept through Persia and into the Levant, they began to consolidate power, creating a new, militaristic political order that would eventually challenge even the ancient prestige of the Byzantine Empire. The Islamic world of this era was a tapestry of immense wealth, scientific advancement, and architectural splendor. From the libraries of Baghdad to the bustling markets of Cairo and Damascus, the Islamic Golden Age had left an indelible mark on human history. Medicine, mathematics, and philosophy flourished in a way that was almost unimaginable to the contemporary European mind. So we have two worlds poised for impact. One is a struggling feudal West, driven by a singular, desperate religious fervor and a need for order. The other is a sophisticated, fractured, and culturally brilliant East, caught in the throes of a massive political transition. They were two different civilizations, separated by sea and creed, unaware that the gears of history were already turning, setting them on a collision course that would reshape the map of the world forever. 1071. The Plains of Manzikert, Anatolia. To understand the desperation that would eventually reach the ears of the Pope, we must look to the moment the shield of Christendom began to crack. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the impregnable bulwark of the East, the successor to Rome, a bastion of Greek learning, Christian liturgy, and sophisticated bureaucracy. While Western Europe was a collection of warring fiefdoms, Byzantium was a superpower, a glittering jewel of marble and gold that commanded the crossroads of the world. But even the greatest walls can crumble. The catalyst for this collapse was the sudden, violent arrival of the Seljuk Turks. These were not the settled, urbanized populations the Byzantines were accustomed to negotiating with. The Seljuks were products of the Central Asian steppes, hardened, mobile, and driven by a relentless martial energy. They did not just want to trade. They wanted to settle, to conquer, and to reshape the landscape in their own image. The collision reached a fever pitch in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. In a catastrophic tactical failure, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was defeated and captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. The implications were seismic. The Byzantine defensive lines in Anatolia, the empire's very heartland and its primary source of grain and soldiers, were blown wide open. Like a dam bursting, the Seljuk horsemen poured into the Anatolian plateau, seizing city after city, leaving the once mighty empire reeling and fragmented. By the time Alexios I Komnenos ascended to the imperial throne in 1081, the situation was nothing short of existential. Alexios was a man of profound intellect and iron will, a survivor of the palace intrigues that had plagued his predecessors. He inherited an empire that was a hollow shell of its former self. Its treasury was depleted, its armies were decimated, and its borders were shrinking by the day. As Alexios looked eastward, he saw the shadow of the Seljuk crescent growing longer. The Turks were no longer just raiding the fringes. They were establishing a permanent presence in the Levant, threatening the very survival of Constantinople itself. The Byzantine machine, for all its ancient sophistication, was simply too exhausted to fight a war of attrition against these relentless nomadic warriors. Alexios realized that the empire could not survive on its own strength. He needed more than just mercenaries. He needed a force that the Seljuks could not easily absorb or outmaneuver. He needed a hammer. In a move of calculated political desperation, Alexios turned his gaze toward the west. He looked toward the Roman Catholic Church, hoping to leverage the shared bond of Christianity to secure military aid. He would reach out to the west not to ask for a holy war, but to ask for professional soldiers, knights and heavy cavalry who could help him reclaim the lost provinces of Anatolia and stabilize his borders. He did not realize that by sending this cry for help, he was lighting a fuse. He was asking for soldiers to defend an empire, but he was about to awaken a religious fire in the West that no emperor could ever hope to control. November 1095, Clermont, France. The message sent by Emperor Alexios. I had traveled across the fractured landscape of Europe, weaving through the courts of kings and the halls of monasteries, until it reached the highest authority in the West. It arrived at a time when the papacy was not merely a spiritual guide, but a political powerhouse locked in a fierce struggle for supremacy with the Holy Roman Empire. Enter Pope Urban II. Urban was a man of immense tactical vision. He understood that the Church needed more than just theological influence. It needed a way to direct the violent, chaotic energies of the European nobility toward a purpose that would serve both God and the papacy. For decades, the knights of Europe had been engaged in a cycle of endless, fratricidal warfare, tearing apart the fabric of Christian society in petty disputes over land and lineage. The Church had long sought to curb this violence through the peace and truce of God movements, but the bloodlust of the warrior class was a tide that would not be stayed. At the Council of Clermont, Urban saw a singular opportunity to channel this destructive force into a constructive, sanctified mission. As he stood before a vast assembly of bishops, clergy, and high-ranking nobles, Urban did not merely present a geopolitical request for military aid to Byzantium. He framed the crisis in the Levant as a cosmic struggle. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians and the desecration of the holy places. He painted a picture of a world in peril, where the very cradle of the faith was being trampled by infidels. But it was his solution that would change the course of human history. Urban introduced a revolutionary concept, the indulgence. He promised that those who took up the cross to reclaim Jerusalem would receive a complete remission of the temporal punishment for their sins. To a society deeply haunted by the specter of eternal damnation and the visceral reality of hell, this was an offer that could not be refused. He was offering a way for the violent to become holy, a way for the killer to become a pilgrim. As his words took hold, a psychological phenomenon began to sweep through the crowd, a collective, ecstatic fervor that would be known as the Deus Vult phenomenon. Deus Vult, they cried, God wills it. It was more than a chant. It was a lightning strike of religious certainty. The phrase became a rhythmic, hypnotic roar that bypassed reason and ignited the soul. In that moment, the political request for mercenaries was transformed into a divine mandate. The struggle was no longer about borders or grain or the survival of an empire. It was about the direct will of the Almighty. The Deus Vult phenomenon stripped away the complexities of diplomacy and replaced them with the absolute clarity of holy war. It unified the disparate, warring factions of Europe under a single, terrifying banner. The knights, the peasants, and the clergy were no longer merely subjects of kings. They were the chosen instruments of heaven. Urban II had intended to send a hammer to stabilize an empire, but instead, he had unleashed a wildfire that would consume the Mediterranean for 2 centuries. The fuse had been lit, and the world was about to burn. Spring 1096, the roads of Europe. While the high nobility and the professional warrior class were still debating the logistics of such a massive undertaking, the wildfire sparked at Clermont had already jumped the gap from the halls of power to the dirt paths of the peasantry. The fervor of Deus Vult did not wait for the orders of kings or the mobilization of knights. It bypassed the hierarchies of the church and the feudal systems of the lords, manifesting instead as a raw, unbridled, and terrifyingly spontaneous movement. At the heart of this madness stood a man who seemed more myth than mortal, Peter the Hermit. A charismatic, ragged preacher of ascetic origins, Peter possessed a voice that could move mountains and a conviction that bordered on the divine. As he traveled from village to village, his sermons were not the structured theological discourses of the clergy, but a primal call to action. He spoke to the illiterate, the dispossessed, and the desperate. He promised them that the path to salvation lay not in prayer alone, but in the dust of the march to Jerusalem. He became the shepherd of a flock that the world was never prepared to lead. This was the people's crusade. It was not an army, it was a migration of the soul. It was composed of thousands of peasants, women, children, and even the elderly, driven by a mixture of genuine religious ecstasy and the crushing poverty of medieval life. To many, the crusade was not just a holy mission, but an escape, a chance to leave behind the starvation and serfdom of Europe for a promised land of milk and honey. But there was no preparation. There was no supply chain, no military discipline, and no strategic foresight. As this massive, wandering tide of humanity moved eastward, it became a force of chaos. The sheer number of mouths to feed placed an impossible strain on the lands they traversed. In many regions, the pilgrims ceased to be seekers of God and became predators of the desperate, engaging in localized looting and violence against the very populations they were meant to pass through. Even more chilling was the dark shadow that fell over the movement before it even left Europe. In the Rhineland, the religious fervor curdled into something much more sinister, a violent, genocidal pogrom against the Jewish communities. These crusaders, convinced that the enemies of Christ were not just in the Levant, but in their own backyards, turned their blades upon Jewish populations in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. It was a terrifying omen of the blood that would define the coming centuries. When the mob finally reached the shores of Byzantium, the tragedy reached its crescendo. Emperor Alexios, wary of this unwashed and unpredictable mass, provided only minimal support. The People's Crusade was a logistical nightmare walking into a geopolitical furnace. As they pushed into the Anatolian interior, they encountered the very force they had been warned about, the battle-hardened Seljuk Turks. Without the heavy cavalry or the steel armor of the professional knights, the peasants were nothing more than fodder. At the Battle of Sivtat, the dream of the People's Crusade was systematically slaughtered. The precursor to the First Crusade ended not in glory, but in a massacre of the innocent and the misguided. The wildfire had burned itself out against the rocks of reality, leaving behind only a trail of blood and a grim lesson for the kings who were yet to follow. Autumn 1096, the Byzantine frontiers. The failure of the People's Crusade had left a bitter, bloody lesson in its wake. Zeal alone could not conquer the East. For the professional armies of the nobility, the true prince's crusade, the march toward Jerusalem would not be a spontaneous migration, but a grueling, calculated, and catastrophic logistical undertaking. Unlike the peasants before them, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond IV of Toulouse moved with the weight of steel, the discipline of feudal levies, and the heavy burden of command. But even the finest knights in Christendom were about to discover that the greatest enemy was not the Turk, but the geography itself. The scale of this mobilization was unprecedented. We are talking about tens of thousands of soldiers, accompanied by a massive train of camp followers, merchants, squires, and non-combatants. This was a moving city of iron and flesh. The logistics were a nightmare of medieval proportions. To move such a force required a constant, desperate flow of grain, wine, and fodder. There were no centralized supply lines. Instead, the Crusaders relied on a precarious mix of purchasing supplies from local Byzantine markets and the inevitable, violent requisitioning of resources from the lands they traversed. As the heavy cavalry began their slow crawl through the Balkans and into the Anatolian gateway, the reality of the march set in. This was not a sprint. It was a war of attrition against the elements. The roads were often nothing more than muddy tracks, barely capable of supporting the heavy destriers and siege engines that the lords brought with them. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion became constant companions. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the marching camps, dysentery and fever claimed as many lives as any arrow or scimitar. Then came the true test, the crossing of Anatolia. For the Crusaders, the Anatolian plateau was a wasteland of heat and hostility. The Seljuk Turks, having learned from the chaos of the People's Crusade, did not meet the knights in open, decisive battles. Instead, they employed the terrifyingly effective tactics of scorched earth and guerrilla warfare. As the Crusader columns pushed deeper into the interior, they found nothing but blackened fields and dried-up wells. The Turks would strike from the ridges, raining arrows upon the slow-moving columns, and then vanish into the dust before a countercharge could be organized. The march became a gauntlet of starvation. Every mile gained was paid for in blood and bone. The heat of the Anatolian sun beat down on armored men who were already dehydrated, while the constant threat of ambush kept them in a state of perpetual, sleep-deprived terror. The landscape itself seemed designed to swallow them whole. It was during this harrowing trek that the Crusaders faced their most defining moment of survival. They were a fractured coalition of ambitious lords, often more interested in their own glory than collective survival, yet they were being forged into a singular, desperate force by the sheer brutality of the journey. They were no longer just pilgrims or lords. They were survivors, hardened by the dust of Anatolia and the hunger of the march, drifting toward a destiny that lay far beyond the horizon. June 1099, the walls of Jerusalem. After the grueling attrition of Anatolia and the hard-won conquest of Antioch, the remnants of the First Crusade arrived at the gates of the Holy City. But they did not arrive as a triumphant army. They arrived as a ghost force. They were emaciated, dehydrated, and dangerously undersupplied. Before them lay the formidable limestone walls of Jerusalem, defended by the Fatimid Caliphate, whose garrison was well provisioned and prepared for the inevitable storm. The Crusaders were faced with a strategic nightmare. They had no siege engines, no towers, and no way to breach the massive fortifications. The surrounding terrain offered little in the way of forage, and the threat of a relief army from Egypt loomed like a shadow over their camp. For days, the Crusader camp was a place of desperate prayer and frantic debate. The lords Godfrey, Raymond, and others were forced to make a choice: retreat and face certain destruction, or gamble everything on a desperate, final assault. The turning point came from an unlikely source: the arrival of Genoese and Pisan ships at the port of Jaffa. These maritime merchants brought more than just supplies. They brought the tools of war. Timber and specialized craftsmen arrived, allowing the Crusaders to construct massive siege towers in the blistering heat. As the wood was being hewn, the Crusaders began a frantic, almost religious labor, working under the sun to build the very machines that would decide the fate of Christendom. On the night of July 13th, the atmosphere in the camp was one of feverish, apocalyptic tension. The siege began in earnest. The heavy siege towers, draped in soaked animal hides to protect them from Greek fire, were rolled toward the northern and southern walls. The sound of iron striking stone and the screams of men under arrow fire filled the night. The climax arrived on the morning of July 15th. Godfrey of Bouillon, commanding one of the great towers, managed to bridge the gap between his machine and the city wall. It was a moment of terrifying precision. As the bridge dropped, the knights surged forward, a tide of steel pouring into the breach. The fighting was claustrophobic and primal, hand-to-hand combat on the narrow ramparts where the distinction between soldier and pilgrim vanished. But the victory was stained with a darkness that would haunt the crusading movement for centuries. As the city fell, the Crusader army unleashed a wave of uncontrolled violence. The streets of Jerusalem became a slaughterhouse. Men, women, and children, Muslims and Jews alike, were cut down in a frenzy that contemporary chroniclers described with a mixture of religious ecstasy and horror. To the Crusaders, this was a purging of the holy site. To the inhabitants, it was an apocalypse. By the time the dust settled, the city was in the hands of the Latins. The conquest was complete, but the era of pilgrimage was over. The victory necessitated a new reality: the creation of permanent Latin structures in the Levant. From the ashes and blood of the siege, the first of the Crusader states began to take shape, most notably the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The dream of reclaiming the East had become a political reality, setting the stage for a centuries-long struggle for control over the Holy Land. July 1099, the Holy City of Jerusalem. The blood had barely dried on the stones of the Temple Mount when the Crusaders faced their most daunting challenge yet. They had conquered a city, but they had not yet built a country. The triumph of the siege was a spiritual high, but the logistical reality was a crushing low. The Crusaders were a collection of disparate feudal lords, each more concerned with their own prestige and territorial claims than with the collective survival of a Christian Levant. To hold this land, they would have to transform from a wandering army of pilgrims into a settled, governing aristocracy. The first and most vital piece of this puzzle was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In the vacuum left by the retreating Fatimids, the Crusaders had to establish a central authority. Godfrey of Bouillon, the hero of the siege, was offered the kingship, but in a gesture of profound, if politically complicated, humility, he refused the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Under his leadership, and later that of his brother Baldwin I, the kingdom began to take shape. It was a feudal patchwork, a collection of fiefs granted to the knights who had survived the march, held together by the singular, unifying purpose of guarding the holy places. But Jerusalem could not stand alone. To the north, the Crusaders had already carved out a precarious foothold in Antioch. Following the grueling, starvation-ridden siege of that great city, Bohemond of Taranto had declared himself prince. The Principality of Antioch became the northern anchor of the Latin East, a bastion of heavy cavalry and Byzantine-style fortification. Yet it was a state born in constant tension, caught between the ambitions of the Crusader lords and the looming threat of the Seljuk Turks to the east. It was a frontier state, forever watching the horizon. Further south, along the fertile coastline, the county of Tripoli began to emerge. Established primarily through the efforts of Raymond of St. Gilles, Tripoli served as a vital link in the chain of Crusader control. It provided the maritime connections necessary for survival, acting as a gateway for the Italian merchant republics to funnel men, arms, and wealth into the Levant. Together, these three entities, the kingdom, the principality, and the county, formed the Outremer, or the lands beyond the sea. This was not a unified empire, but a fragile confederation of Latin enclaves dropped into a complex, deeply entrenched Islamic landscape. They were islands of Western feudalism in a Levantan sea. The settlers faced a daunting task. They had to build castles where there were none, establish laws in a land with different customs, and cultivate fields that had been ravaged by war. They were an occupying force of a tiny minority, surrounded by a vast and increasingly hostile population. As the dust of the First Crusade settled, the foundations of faith were being laid not just in prayer, but in stone, steel, and blood. The era of the conquest was ending. The era of survival had begun. Circa 1120, the rugged hills of the Levant. As the initial fervor of the conquest faded, a grim reality set in for the settlers of Outremer. The Latin states were, in essence, a thin crust of Western nobility spread across a vast, volatile landscape. The feudal levies of the local lords were often too slow to react to the sudden, lightning raids of Turkish horse archers, and the sheer distance from Europe meant that reinforcements were always months, if not years, away. The Crusader states were perpetually on a war footing, yet they lacked a standing, professionalized force capable of defending the holy sites and the pilgrim routes around the clock. It was out of this desperate necessity that a new kind of warrior was born, the monk knight. This was a revolutionary fusion of two worlds that had previously remained distinct: the asceticism of the monastery and the violence of the knightly class. The first to emerge from this crucible were the poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known more famously as the Knights Templar. Their origin was humble, rooted in a small group of knights led by Hugues de Payens, who sought nothing more than to protect the destitute pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. But as the vulnerability of the roads became clear, the mission evolved. They were no longer just protectors. They became a specialized military elite. Bound by monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Templars were unique. They did not fight for land or personal glory, but as a disciplined, holy instrument of the Church. Their white mantles, emblazoned with the Red Cross, became a symbol of terror to their enemies and a beacon of hope to the faithful. While the Templars became the masters of the battlefield and the architects of a sophisticated international banking network, another order rose to meet a different, perhaps more intimate need: the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. The Hospitaliers began as a charitable organization dedicated to the care of the sick and the poor in the newly conquered territories. Their headquarters was a massive hospital in Jerusalem, where they tended to the wounds of both pilgrim and soldier alike. However, as the political tides turned, the Hospitaliers realized that providing medicine was not enough if there was no one left to defend the patients. Slowly, the healers transformed into warriors. The hospital became a fortress, and the nursing brothers became armored knights. Like the Templars, they developed a highly organized military structure, but where the Templars were often seen as the shock cavalry of the Crusades, the Hospitaliers became the masters of fortification, holding the vital coastal strongholds and massive castles that anchored the Latin defense. These military orders changed the very nature of the Crusades. They provided the Latin East with something the feudal lords could not: a permanent, professional, and ideologically driven standing army. They were the iron spine of the Crusader states. Through their immense wealth, their vast networks of commanderies stretching back to Europe, and their unwavering devotion, the Templars and Hospitaliers ensured that the islands of Outremer would not be swept away by the rising tide of the Islamic world. They were the Knights of the Cross, men who lived by the sword but died for the soul. Circa 1144, the corridors of power in the Latin East. But while the Templars and Hospitaliers provided an iron spine of defense, the body they supported was far from a unified whole. To understand the survival of Outremer, one must look past the shining armor of the military orders and into the treacherous, often claustrophobic halls of the Crusader courts. The Latin East was not a monolithic empire. It was a fragile patchwork of competing interests, held together by nothing more than shared faith and a desperate, mutual need for survival. The political landscape was a labyrinth of tension. On one hand, you had the secular nobility, the kings of Jerusalem, the counts of Tripoli, and the princes of Antioch. These men were often more concerned with their own dynastic ambitions and territorial borders than with the grand design of a holy war. Rivalries between noble houses were common, and the succession to the throne of Jerusalem was a perennial source of instability. A king could be a brilliant strategist one year and a puppet of a powerful faction the next. On the other hand, you had the immense, often overbearing influence of the church and the military orders. The Templars and Hospitallers were not merely soldiers, they were sovereign entities. They held their own lands, answered directly to the Pope, and often possessed more wealth and political leverage than the very kings they were meant to serve. This created a volatile state within a state. Friction between the secular lords, who demanded taxes and military service, and the monastic orders, who claimed exemption from such burdens, frequently paralyzed the decision-making processes of the Latin Levant. Compounding this internal friction was the complex reality of the local population. The Crusaders were a thin veneer of Western European elite ruling over a vast majority of Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. To survive, the Latin lords had to engage in a delicate dance of diplomacy and pragmatism. They often entered into local truces with Muslim emirs, trading silk and spices for periods of peace. They relied on local administrative structures, and even employed local Eastern Christians to manage the intricacies of the Levantan economy. This pragmatism, however, was a double-edged sword. To the hardliners in Europe, any negotiation with the infidel was seen as a betrayal of the crusading ideal. To the settlers in Outremer, it was often the only way to keep the cities fed and the borders secure. This internal fragmentation created a fatal paradox. The Crusader states were at their most dangerous when they were most divided. While the Frankish lords squabbled over precedence in court, and the military orders vied for political dominance, the Islamic world was undergoing a profound transformation. The decentralized, fractured nature of the Seljuk territories was beginning to give way to a new, more unified movement of resistance. The Latin East was a house divided, fighting a war on two fronts, one against the external threat of a rising Islamic tide, and an equally exhausting, invisible war against its own internal contradictions. They were masters of the castle and the battlefield, but they were increasingly failing the test of political unity. And in the Levant, where a single mistake could mean the fall of a kingdom, such division was a luxury they could ill afford. 1144, the city of Edessa. While the Frankish lords were preoccupied with the intricacies of courtly etiquette and the internal power struggles of the Latin East, a seismic shift was occurring just beyond their borders. The era of fractured, localized resistance was coming to an end. The patchwork of competing Muslim emirs, who had spent decades bickering amongst themselves, was about to be welded together by the iron will of a single man, Imad ad-Din Zengi. Zengi was not a man of diplomacy or compromise. He was a warlord of the old school, a ruler who understood that the fragmented state of the Islamic world was the greatest gift the Crusaders had ever received. To Zengi, the presence of the Franks in the Levant was not just a territorial nuisance. It was a profound religious affront that required a unified response. He began a relentless campaign of consolidation, swallowing up smaller principalities and forcing local emirs into submission, all under the banner of a singular, revitalizing purpose. The turning point came with the siege of Edessa. In a lightning campaign that sent shockwaves through the Christian Levant, Zengi's forces captured the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states to be established. The fall of Edessa was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Crusaders realized that their presence in the East was not a permanent divine mandate, but a precarious occupation that could be dismantled. But Zengi's greatest legacy was not the city he conquered, but the fire he ignited. He had breathed life into the concept of jihad, not merely as a term for struggle, but as a mobilizing political and religious ideology. He demonstrated that the Islamic world could and must unite to expel the invaders. Upon his death, this flame did not flicker out. It was passed to his son, Nur ad-Din. If Zengi was the blunt instrument of unification, Nur ad-Din was its sophisticated architect. Where his father relied on raw conquest, Nur ad-Din combined military prowess with a profound, almost ascetic piety. He understood that to defeat the Crusaders, he had to win the hearts and minds of the Muslim populace. Nur ad-Din transformed the struggle from a series of local skirmishes into a holy mission. He invested heavily in mosques, madrasas, and hospitals, presenting himself not just as a king, but as the champion of the faith. He cultivated a sense of religious duty that transcended tribal loyalties, weaving together the disparate threads of Syria and Mesopotamia into a cohesive political fabric. Under his leadership, the first stirrings of jihad became a roaring movement. As Nur ad-Din consolidated his power, the Latin East found itself increasingly isolated. The era of negotiating truces with minor, local emirs was over. The Crusaders were no longer facing a collection of squabbling neighbors. They were facing a unified, ideologically driven juggernaut. The shadow of a new, organized resistance was lengthening over the Levant, and the fragile, divided foundations of the Crusader states were beginning to tremble under the weight of a rising, unified tide. 1169. The banks of the Nile, Egypt. If Nur ad-Din was the architect of a unified Islamic resistance, he was still missing the final, most vital piece of the geopolitical puzzle: Egypt. For decades, the Fatimid Caliphate had ruled Egypt from Cairo, but by the mid-12th century, it was a hollow shell, a decaying empire fractured by internal coups and religious instability. This power vacuum created a dangerous opportunity. If the Crusaders could seize Egypt, they could surround the Syrian territories and crush the movement Nur ad-Din had built. If the Syrians could take Egypt, they would possess the wealth, the grain, and the manpower to finally sweep the Franks into the sea. Enter Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin. Saladin was not born to a throne, nor was he a man of sudden, violent revolution. He was a Kurd, a soldier of fortune who rose through the ranks of the Zengid military machine. He was a man of immense patience, combining a sharp tactical mind with a reputation for profound piety and a surprising degree of mercy. His ascent began not with a conquest of land, but with a conquest of stability. Sent by Nur ad-Din to secure Egypt, Saladin found a land in chaos. Through a masterful blend of military decisiveness and political maneuvering, he neutralized the Fatimid viziers and, eventually, became the de facto ruler of Egypt. But Saladin's ambitions were not merely local. He understood what Nur ad-Din had envisioned, that the struggle against the Crusader states could only be won if the two great pillars of the Islamic world, Egypt and Syria, were fused into a single, unbreakable entity. The path to this unification was fraught with peril. Saladin had to navigate a treacherous landscape of shifting loyalties, where his former masters in Syria viewed him with suspicion, and the Frankish lords in the Levant saw him as a rising existential threat. He was a man caught between two worlds, attempting to bridge the gap between the Egyptian Nile and the Syrian Orontes. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Following the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, the dream of a unified front faced a moment of crisis. The Syrian cities, once held together by the charisma of Nur ad-Din, drifted toward fragmentation. It was here that Saladin's true genius emerged. He did not merely conquer these cities, he reclaimed them. He presented himself not as a foreign usurper, but as the legitimate successor to the holy mission of the Zengids. One by one, the great centers of Syria, Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, fell under his influence. Through marriage alliances, diplomacy, and targeted military campaigns, Saladin welded the wealth of Egypt to the fervor of Syria. He had achieved what many thought impossible. He had created a superpower in the heart of the Middle East. The Lion of Islam had arrived. The fragmented, localized resistance that the Crusaders had so easily manipulated for a century was gone. In its place stood a unified, ideologically driven empire, commanded by a man whose name would become synonymous with both chivalry and conquest. The stage was now set. The unification was complete, the armies were mobilized, and the Latin East was about to face a storm unlike any it had ever endured. July 1187, the Horns of Hattin, Galilee. For nearly a century, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had survived through a precarious balance of fortified strongholds and internal political maneuvering. But the unified empire of Saladin had shattered that balance. The Crusader states were no longer facing a collection of squabbling emirs. They were facing a singular, unstoppable juggernaut. As the summer heat began to bake the Levant, the tension within the Frankish leadership reached a breaking point. The kingdom was divided by a bitter political schism. On one side stood the Old Guard, led by the experienced, cautious Reynold of Chatillon, a man whose reckless raids on Muslim caravans had personally insulted Saladin. On the other stood the young, inexperienced King Guy of Lusignan, a monarch struggling to assert authority over a fractured nobility. Saladin, sensing the fragility of the Christian leadership, played a masterful game of provocation. He besieged the town of Tiberias, not merely to capture it, but to draw the Crusader army out from the safety of their fortified positions. He knew that in this terrain, the Crusaders' greatest strength, their heavy cavalry, could be turned into their greatest weakness. The trap was set. Against the frantic advice of seasoned commanders like Raymond of Tripoli, King Guy made a fateful decision. To prove his legitimacy and his courage, he ordered the massive Crusader army to march across the waterless, sun-scorched plateau of Galilee to relieve Tiberias. It was a march into a furnace. As the heavy infantry and knights trudged through the arid hills, the heat became an enemy more lethal than any sword. Saladin's light cavalry harried them relentlessly, raining arrows upon the columns, never allowing them a moment of rest. By the time the Crusaders reached the vicinity of the Horns of Hattin, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and trapped in a landscape of dust and shimmering heat. Then the final blow was delivered. Saladin's forces set fire to the dry scrub brush surrounding the Crusader camp. As the wind whipped the flames toward the Christian lines, the soldiers were choked by thick, black smoke, blinded and suffocated. The thirst was agonizing. The very water they needed was held by the enemy just across the dry plains. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a defeat, it was a slaughter. The heavy cavalry, once the terror of the East, found themselves bogged down in the sand and smoke, unable to charge. The infantry, broken by thirst and exhaustion, collapsed under the weight of the Saracen onslaught. In a matter of hours, the flower of Frankish chivalry was extinguished. The consequences were catastrophic. King Guy was captured, and the true cross, the most sacred relic of the Latin kingdom, was lost to the Muslim forces. But the physical loss of the army was only the beginning. With the defending forces decimated, the gates of the Holy Land were left wide open. The shield of the Levant had been shattered, and the road to Jerusalem lay undefended. The era of Crusader dominance was over. The era of Saladin had begun. September 1187. The walls of Jerusalem. The destruction at the Horns of Hattin had left the Latin kingdom of the Levant a hollowed shell. For decades, the survival of the Crusader states had relied on a delicate equilibrium, a network of castles and garrisoned cities that could withstand sieges until reinforcements arrived. But that equilibrium was built on the existence of a standing field army. At Hattin, that army had ceased to exist. The knights, the infantry, and the seasoned commanders were gone, replaced by a landscape of panicked refugees and abandoned outposts. As Saladin's forces swept southward, the realization set in across the Levant. The shield had not just been dented, it had been pulverized. The road to the Holy City was no longer a contested frontier, it was an open highway. The siege of Jerusalem began not with a grand, coordinated assault, but with the terrifying momentum of an unstoppable tide. As the Ayyubid armies approached the city walls, the panic within Jerusalem was absolute. The city's defenders were a desperate patchwork of survivors, many of whom had escaped the slaughter in Galilee, now tasked with holding the gates against a foe that had already broken the back of their kingdom. Balian of Ibelin, a seasoned lord and a man of immense pragmatic skill, found himself thrust into a position of desperate leadership. He knew that the city could not hold indefinitely. The wells were limited, the walls were strained, and the psychological weight of the approaching Saracen banners was crushing. He faced a choice that would define the legacy of the city, a futile, bloody resistance that might result in a massacre of the inhabitants or a calculated surrender. As the siege engines began to batter the walls, Balian realized that the survival of the Christian population rested on a single, high-stakes negotiation. He rode out from the gates to meet Saladin, seeking terms that would allow the inhabitants to depart with their lives and their dignity. The negotiations were a tense dance of religious fervor and political pragmatism. For the Muslims, reclaiming Jerusalem was the ultimate fulfillment of jihad. For the Christians, it was the loss of the center of their universe. However, Saladin, mindful of his reputation for chivalry and the need to maintain order in a conquered holy site, opted for a path of mercy rather than vengeance. A ransom was set. Each soul within the walls was to pay a sum for their freedom. For those who could not afford it, the terms were even more harrowing, yet Saladin ultimately showed a restraint that would echo through the centuries. On the 2nd of October, the gates of the Holy City were opened. In a scene of profound sorrow and chaotic transition, thousands of Christians began their exodus, carrying what few belongings they could, walking away from the altars and the tombs they had called home for 88 years. As the sun set on the fall of Jerusalem, the map of the Middle East had been fundamentally rewritten. The Crusader states were no longer a sovereign power. They were survivors clinging to the coastline. The dream of a Latin kingdom centered on the Holy Sepulchre had collapsed, leaving behind a vacuum that only the greatest kings of Europe would attempt to fill. 1189. The Rhineland and the Holy Roman Empire. The fall of Jerusalem had sent a shockwave through the courts of Europe, a seismic tremor that transformed grief into a frantic, holy rage. This was no longer a struggle for borderlands or trade routes. It was a cosmic necessity. The vacuum left by the collapse of the Latin kingdom demanded a response of unprecedented scale. It required more than just knights. It required the absolute authority of the crown. And so the Third Crusade began, not as a disorganized pilgrimage, but as a collision of the three greatest powers in the Christian world. Leading the charge was Frederick I, known to history as Barbarossa. The Holy Roman Emperor was a titan of the Old World, a man whose authority was synonymous with the very concept of imperial majesty. He was aged, but his presence was colossal. For Frederick, this was a crusade of legitimacy and divine mandate. He assembled a massive, disciplined force, moving across Europe with the weight of an empire behind him. He was the seasoned veteran, the man who intended to march straight to the heart of the Levant and restore the dignity of the cross through sheer, overwhelming momentum. But as the German host crossed the Anatolian plains, tragedy struck with the indifference of fate. While crossing the Salef River, Barbarossa, the man who seemed invincible, drowned. In an instant, the momentum of the largest crusading army ever assembled fractured. The German princes, leaderless and disillusioned by the loss of their emperor, began to splinter, drifting away from the primary objective. The dream of a singular, imperial reconquest died in those waters, leaving the path open for two other titans to vie for the glory of the East. 1190, the shores of Acre. As the German dream dissolved, the stage was set for a rivalry that would define the chivalric age. Enter Philip II Augustus of France and Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. To understand their arrival, one must understand their enmity. Philip was a master of politics, a cold, calculating strategist who viewed the crusade as a means to consolidate the French crown. He was a king of shadows and bureaucracy, playing a long game of territorial acquisition back in Europe. Richard, however, was a king of blood and iron. He was the antithesis of Philip, a warrior monarch who spent more time in the saddle than in the palace. Richard lived for the clash of steel. For him, the crusade was not a political maneuver. It was a personal vendetta against the forces that had taken Jerusalem. When the two kings finally converged upon the besieged city of Acre, the tension was palpable. They were allies by necessity, bound by a common vow, but they were rivals by nature. Philip sought a quick victory to secure his borders. Richard sought a total, legendary conquest to cement his soul. As the siege engines groaned and the walls of Acre crumbled under the weight of their combined might, the crusade ceased to be a mere religious mission. It became a theater of ego, a clash of kings, and a struggle for individual immortality. The era of the kings had arrived, and the Levant was about to become the anvil upon which their legacies would be forged. 1191, the scorched plains near Jaffa. With the fall of Acre, the crusade had transitioned from a grand imperial expedition into a high-stakes duel between two men who, despite being separated by faith and language, understood each other with a clarity no other contemporary could claim. On one side stood Richard the Lionheart, the quintessential warrior king, a man whose very name evoked the fury of the storm. On the other stood Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the architect of Islamic unity, a man whose reputation for wisdom, piety, and tactical brilliance had already humbled the Latin East. This was no longer just a war of attrition. It was a psychological chess match played out across a landscape of sun-bleached stone and blood-soaked sand. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin would become the stuff of legend, a mythic collision that transcended the battlefield to touch the very soul of chivalry. As Richard marched south toward Jaffa, his every movement was watched by the eyes of the Sultan's scouts. Saladin, realizing that the English king was a far more formidable and unpredictable foe than the previous leaders of the crusade, refused to engage in a single, decisive pitched battle where Richard's heavy cavalry might shatter his lines. Instead, Saladin employed a strategy of scorched earth and relentless harassment. He utilized the heat, the thirst, and the archers to bleed the Crusader host, turning the march into a grueling test of human endurance. Yet in the midst of this brutal combat, an extraordinary phenomenon emerged, a mutual grudging respect that defied the religious hatred fueling their armies. When Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin, in an act that would baffle his own emirs, sent him baskets of chilled fruit and snow from the mountains to break the heat. When Richard's horse was slain in the heat of battle, Saladin sent him 2 fresh mounts, acknowledging that a king of such stature should not fight on foot like a common soldier. To the chroniclers of the age, this was not mere kindness. It was the recognition of equals. They were 2 predators in a world of prey, 2 titans who saw in the other the only worthy opponent. But this respect did not soften the steel of their conflict. The Battle of Arsuf would prove Richard's tactical genius, as he maintained a discipline under fire that Saladin's light cavalry could not break. The Lionheart proved that he could not be bullied by the desert, and Saladin proved that he could not be driven from his lands by sheer force of will. As the campaign ground on, a bitter reality began to set in for both men. Richard had the military brilliance to take the coast, but he lacked the manpower to hold Jerusalem. Saladin had the numbers to defend the Holy City, but he could not decisively destroy Richard's army. They were locked in a magnificent, bloody stalemate. The crusade had become a personal saga of 2 men chasing a ghost, the city of Jerusalem, while caught in the gravitational pull of each other's greatness. The Levant was no longer just a battlefield. It had become the stage for a duel between the 2 most iconic figures of the Middle Ages. 1191, the salt-sprayed walls of Acre. While the legend of Richard and Saladin is often framed by their personal duel on the open plains, the true crucible of the Third Crusade, the event that fundamentally altered the map of the Levant, was the grueling, claustrophobic nightmare of the Siege of Acre. For 2 agonizing years, this coastal stronghold had been the focal point of a geopolitical storm, a city that refused to fall, and a siege that had become a siege within a siege. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must visualize the scene, a chaotic circular battlefield. On one side, the besieged garrison of Acre, bolstered by the fierce resolve of Saladin's relief forces. On the other, the Crusader armies, locked in a desperate attempt to breach the city's formidable defenses. It was a stalemate of epic proportions, a grinding machinery of death where the Mediterranean waves crashed against blood-stained ramparts. The siege had begun in 1189, long before Richard the Lionheart arrived on the scene. It was a period of profound desperation for the Latin East. The Crusader camp was a place of pestilence, starvation, and mounting frustration. Men died not just from the arrows of the Saracens, but from the invisible killers of dysentery and fever. The Crusader leadership was fractured, plagued by internal rivalries and the sheer logistical impossibility of maintaining a blockade against a sultan who could strike from the desert at any moment. But the arrival of the European monarchs changed the mathematics of the slaughter. When Philip Augustus of France and Richard of England descended upon the coast, the siege transformed from a stagnant blockade into a violent, industrial-scale assault. The air grew thick with the smoke of siege engines, massive trebuchets and mangonels that hurled boulders with the intent of shattering stone and bone alike. The struggle for the coastal strongholds was not merely about territory. It was about the lifeline of the Crusader states. Without the ports of Acre, Tripoli, and Tyre, the Latin presence in the east was a body without blood, unable to receive the reinforcements and supplies necessary to survive. Acre was the gateway. If it fell, the crusade had a chance to breathe. If it held, the movement would wither in the sand. The final assault was a descent into madness. Under the relentless pressure of the combined European fleets and the heavy infantry of the military orders, the city's defenses finally buckled. The breach was not a moment of glory, but a chaotic eruption of steel and screams. As the gates were forced, the long-standing tension between the besiegers and the besieged exploded into a massacre. The fall of Acre in the summer of 1191 was a Pyrrhic victory. It provided the Crusaders with a vital base of operations and a foothold on the coast, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of prisoners were executed in a fit of vengeful rage, and the sheer exhaustion of the survivors left the Crusader army a shadow of its former self. Acre had been won, but the prize they had truly come for, the holy city of Jerusalem, remained tantalizingly out of reach, shielded by the shadow of the Sultan's armies. The coastal war was won, but the war for the soul of the Levant was only just beginning. 1191, the sun-scorched plains of Ascalon. With the fall of Acre secured, the momentum of the Third Crusade seemed, for a fleeting moment, unstoppable. Richard the Lionheart had proven himself a master of siege warfare and a terror on the battlefield. The path to Jerusalem lay open, stretching through the narrow coastal strip toward the heart of the Levant. But as the Crusader army began its march southward, the romanticized vision of a triumphant return to the Holy City collided with a brutal, unforgiving reality. The fundamental problem was not a lack of courage, but a fatal lack of depth. Richard possessed the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom and a command structure of unparalleled ferocity, yet he was marching into a logistical nightmare. To reach Jerusalem, he had to navigate a corridor of death, flanked on one side by the unforgiving Mediterranean and on the other by the rugged, hostile terrain of the Judean hills, terrain controlled by Saladin's highly mobile light cavalry. Saladin, a strategist of profound patience, understood this perfectly. He did not seek a single, decisive clash of knights on an open field where Richard's charge might shatter his lines. Instead, he employed a strategy of attrition. As the Crusaders moved inland, the Sultan's forces harassed their flanks, raining arrows from the heights and cutting off foraging parties. The Crusaders were forced to march in a tight, defensive column, protected by a constant screen of infantry to shield the horses from the relentless harassment. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through a gauntlet of fire. Furthermore, the shadow of the scorched earth policy loomed large. To deny the Crusaders the resources they desperately needed, Saladin's forces systematically destroyed wells, burned crops, and dismantled fortifications along the route. Every mile gained by the Christians was paid for in sweat, thirst, and the mounting toll of exhaustion. The tension reached its breaking point at the siege of Ascalon. Richard saw the city as a vital stepping stone, a fortress that could secure the coast and provide a permanent base for any future attempts on Jerusalem. But the siege became a strategic trap. To take Ascalon was to commit his forces to a prolonged investment, leaving his rear vulnerable to a massive counterattack from Saladin's main army. Richard stood at a crossroads of history. He faced a devastating tactical dilemma. If he marched on Jerusalem, he might capture the Holy City, but he would be unable to hold it. The Crusader army was too small, too far from the sea, and too vulnerable to being cut off from its supply lines. If he captured the walls of the Holy Sepulchre only to see his army starved into submission by the desert, the crusade would end in a catastrophe far greater than any defeat at sea. The stalemate was not merely one of steel against stone, but of geography against ambition. Jerusalem was a prize that required more than just victory. It required occupation, and occupation required a stability that the Third Crusade could not provide. The Lionheart realized that while he could win battles, he could not conquer the landscape itself. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem was held captive not by the strength of Saladin's walls, but by the sheer, insurmountable impossibility of sustaining a kingdom in the heart of an empire. September 1192, the salt-sprayed shores of Jaffa. The relentless cycle of blood and dust had reached a point of exhaustion. For months, the two greatest commanders of the age had played a high-stakes game of chess across the Levanten landscape, each waiting for the other to stumble. Richard the Lionheart was a man of action, yet he found himself paralyzed by the strategic vacuum of the Holy Land. Saladin was a man of principle, yet he found himself drained by the unrelenting pressure of the Crusader presence. The stalemate had become a weight that neither king could continue to carry. In the camps surrounding the coastal cities, the reality was grim. The Crusader armies were bleeding from attrition, their supplies dwindling, and the political will in Europe was beginning to fray. Meanwhile, Saladin's unified empire was strained by the cost of a perpetual war that refused to yield a definitive conclusion. The grand ambitions of the Third Crusade, the total reclamation of the Holy City, were dissolving into a desperate struggle for survival and sustainability. It was in this atmosphere of mutual exhaustion that the negotiations began. This was not a peace born of friendship, but a peace born of necessity. Through intermediaries, the terms were hammered out. The Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were a masterclass in pragmatic compromise, though they left both sides feeling the sting of unfinished business. For the Christians, the concession was profound. They would relinquish all claims to Jerusalem. The Holy City would remain under the sovereignty of the Ayyubid Sultan. To the knights who had marched across continents for the sake of the sepulchre, this felt like a spiritual defeat. However, Richard was a realist. He recognized that a kingdom without a hinterland was merely a graveyard. The treaty granted the Crusaders control over a vital strip of the coastline, stretching from Tyre to Jaffa. This narrow corridor, the survival of the coast, would serve as a lifeline. It secured the major Mediterranean ports, allowing the maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa to continue funneling men, gold, and supplies into the Levant. It turned the Crusader presence from a fleeting expedition into a permanent, albeit fragile, coastal entity. Furthermore, a crucial concession was made regarding the pilgrims. While the city remained Muslim, the treaty guaranteed safe passage for unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy Sepulchre. It was a thin thread of religious continuity in a land defined by division, but it provided a semblance of the spiritual purpose that had ignited the crusade in the first place. As the ink dried on the treaty, the immediate threat of total annihilation receded, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. The Treaty of Jaffa did not settle the question of who owned the Holy Land. It merely paused the clock. It created a landscape of coexistence defined by borders, watchful eyes, and a tenuous balance of power. Richard would soon depart for Europe, leaving behind a kingdom that was little more than a string of fortified coastal towns. The Third Crusade had failed in its primary mission, yet it had achieved something unexpected. It had ensured that the Latin East would endure for another century. The dream of Jerusalem was deferred, but the survival of the coast had ensured that the struggle for the Levant was far from over. 1202. The corridors of power in Rome and the bustling markets of Venice. The Treaty of Jaffa had provided a reprieve, but it had not provided a solution. For the leaders of the Latin East, the reality was increasingly claustrophobic. They were masters of a thin, precarious strip of coastline, perpetually looking inward toward the vast, unified Islamic territories that hemmed them in. They held the ports, but they did not hold the heart of the Levant. To truly reclaim Jerusalem, they realized they could not simply strike at the walls of the holy city. They had to strike at the source of its strength. That strength lay south, in the fertile, wealthy, and strategically dominant Nile Delta. Egypt was the jewel of the Ayyubid Empire, the economic engine that fueled the resistance against the Crusaders. It was the granary of the Mediterranean and the gateway to the Red Sea. The strategic logic was as cold as it was clear. If the Crusaders could conquer Egypt, they could sever the lifeline of the Ayyubid Sultanate, isolate Syria, and finally force the gates of Jerusalem to swing open. This was the birth of a new strategic paradigm. The crusade was no longer merely a pilgrimage of penance or a quest for holy sites. It was evolving into a war of geopolitical conquest. The call went out for a new crusade, one focused not on the desert sands of Judea, but on the riverbanks of the Nile. But a campaign of this magnitude required more than just religious fervor. It required a massive, coordinated naval invasion. The Crusaders lacked the fleet necessary to transport an army across the Mediterranean and sustain a siege against the formidable fortifications of the Nile Delta. They were a land power in desperate need of a maritime hammer. In this vacuum of resources, a shadow loomed large: Venice. The Venetian Republic was at the height of its maritime supremacy. Their wealth was built on the waves, and their interest in the Levant was driven by more than just piety. It was driven by the bottom line. When the call for an Egyptian expedition reached the lagoons of Venice, the Doge and the merchant princes saw an opportunity that was too lucrative to ignore. The Crusaders, heavily indebted from the previous wars and lacking the capital to commission a massive fleet, turned to the Venetians. They offered gold, ships, and sailors in exchange for the promise of future trade dominance. It was a marriage of necessity between the spiritual ambitions of the papacy and the commercial hunger of the Republic. Yet, even as the plans for the invasion of Egypt began to take shape, the nature of the crusade was shifting. The lines between the holy war and mercantile enterprise were beginning to blur. The Crusaders were no longer just soldiers of Christ. They were becoming clients of a maritime empire. As the fleets were commissioned and the debts were tallied, the crusade was being steered away from the direct path to the Nile and toward a destiny that would eventually lead them far from the shores of Egypt, toward a destination that would shatter the very foundations of Christendom. 1202. The salt-sprayed lagoons of Venice and the grand halls of the ducal palace. The contract signed between the Crusader leadership and the Republic of Venice was nothing short of staggering. To transport a massive army to the Nile, the Crusaders commissioned a fleet of unparalleled scale. The price tag was set at 85,000 silver marks, a sum so astronomical it bordered on the impossible for a group of knights and nobles whose coffers were already depleted by decades of warfare. Venice would provide the ships, the sailors, and the logistics, but the Crusaders were effectively signing a promissory note written in blood and gold. At the center of this web of debt stood one of the most formidable figures of the Middle Ages, Doge Enrico Dandolo. To look upon him was to see a man who embodied the paradox of Venice itself. Though he was well into his 80s and blind, his intellect was razor-sharp, and his vision for the Republic was even sharper. Dandolo was not merely a religious leader or a statesman. He was the architect of Venetian hegemony. He understood a fundamental truth that the crusading knights often overlooked. In the Mediterranean, he who controls the sea controls the world. As the Crusader host gathered, a catastrophic realization began to settle over the camp. The numbers were not adding up. The crusading army, drawn from across Europe, was significantly smaller than the Venetian planners had anticipated. There were not enough men to fill the ships, and more importantly, there were not enough men to pay the mounting bill. The debt to Venice was not just a financial burden, it was a noose tightening around the neck of the entire expedition. Dandolo, ever the pragmatist, saw this crisis not as a failure but as leverage. The Crusaders were trapped. They could not sail without the Venetian fleet, and they could not pay for the fleet they had already commissioned. They were effectively hostages to the Republic's maritime machine. The Doge, navigating the delicate balance between his role as a Christian leader and his duty to his city-state, began to steer the conversation away from the Nile and toward more immediate opportunities. The Venetian ambition was not to fund a holy war that might fail. It was to ensure that, regardless of the outcome, Venice emerged as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean trade routes. If the Crusaders could not pay their debt in silver, they would have to pay it in territory, in ports, and in political concessions. The pivot began with a suggestion to strike at the Christian city of Zara, a port on the Adriatic that stood in the way of Venetian interests. When the Pope threatened excommunication for such an act, the tension between spiritual mandate and mercantile reality reached a breaking point. Dandolo, sensing the Crusaders' desperation, began to weave a new path. He presented a way out of their debt, a diversion. If the Crusaders could assist Venice in neutralizing its rivals, the debt might be forgiven. The crusade, intended to strike at the heart of Islam in Egypt, was being systematically dismantled and reconstructed. The holy mission was being hijacked by the cold, calculating logic of the Venetian ledger. The knights were no longer just warriors of the cross. They were becoming the unpaid mercenaries of a commercial empire, marching toward a destiny that would lead them not to the Nile, but to the very gates of the greatest Christian city in the world. 1203. The rugged coastline of the Dalmatian Sea, where the wind carries the scent of salt and the shadow of betrayal. The siege of Zara had been a grim prelude, a stain upon the soul of the expedition that could not be washed away by prayer. But as the Crusader fleet sailed southward, the destination was no longer the sands of Egypt. The debt to Venice had not been settled, it had merely been transformed. The Crusaders were adrift, caught in a whirlpool of Venetian interests, and the next vortex was waiting for them in the Aegean. The diversion was not a sudden accident, but a calculated pivot fueled by a desperate opportunity. Word had reached the fleet of a fractured empire. The Byzantine Empire was in the throes of a dynastic civil war. Prince Alexios Angelos, the exiled son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, had sent a frantic plea to the Crusader camp. He offered a deal that seemed, on the surface, to be the ultimate solution to their insolvency. If the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and restore him to his throne, he would pay the Venetian debt in full, provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the Holy War, and bring the Greek Church back into submission under the authority of Rome. To the knights, it sounded like a divine providence, a way to fund the journey to Jerusalem by restoring a Christian brother. To Doge Dandolo, it was a masterstroke of geopolitical engineering. By installing a puppet on the Byzantine throne, Venice would secure unparalleled commercial privileges and weaken the greatest obstacle to their maritime dominance. The fleet turned its prows toward the Golden Horn. As the massive Venetian galleys appeared on the horizon, the inhabitants of Constantinople looked out from their legendary Theodosian walls with a mixture of awe and mounting dread. They had seen crusaders before, but never an army that moved with the predatory precision of a commercial enterprise. When the crusaders arrived, the atmosphere was not one of holy liberation, but of tense negotiation. Alexios IV was indeed installed on the throne, but the reality of the Byzantine treasury was far bleaker than the prince had promised. The coffers were empty. The gold was gone. The promises made to the Crusaders and the Venetians were hollow echoes in the marble halls of the Blasharny Palace. The Crusaders found themselves stranded in the greatest city in Christendom, not as conquerors but as creditors. They were hungry, unpaid, and increasingly resentful of the decadent Greeks they were supposed to be rescuing. The tension between the Latin host and the Byzantine populace simmered like a fever. Every day that passed without the promised silver sharpened the Crusaders' sense of betrayal. The holy mission had been completely eclipsed. The men who had set out to fight for the Holy Sepulchre were now standing on the precipice of a much darker endeavor. The diversion was no longer a detour. It had become a trap. The Crusaders were no longer looking toward the Levant. They were looking at the glittering wealth of Constantinople, and for the first time, the line between the soldier of Christ and the plunderer of cities had vanished entirely. April 1204, the Golden Horn, Constantinople. The tension that had been simmering in the streets of the Queen of Cities finally boiled over into a nightmare. The promised gold never arrived, and in the vacuum of empty coffers, a new, more ruthless power rose to the Byzantine throne, Alexios V, a man who had no intention of honoring the debts of his predecessor. To the Crusaders, this was not merely a political shift, it was a total breach of contract. The religious mission was dead. In its place was a cold, hard necessity for survival and retribution. On the morning of April 12th, the silence of the city was shattered by the thunder of siege engines. The Crusaders, driven by a volatile cocktail of starvation, religious resentment, and Venetian greed, launched a coordinated assault. They did not strike at the walls of a heretical foe, but at the very heart of Eastern Christendom. Through sheer ferocity and the tactical brilliance of the Venetian fleet, the defenses were breached. The legendary Theodosian walls, which had stood for a millennium against 1,000 different foes, could not hold against the brothers they were meant to protect. What followed was not a conquest, but a systematic slaughter. For 3 days, the streets of Constantinople ran red. The Crusaders, fueled by a perceived righteousness and a desperate hunger for loot, unleashed a frenzy of violence that defied the very vows they had taken at the Council of Clermont. They did not merely seek gold, they sought to erase the identity of the people they had sworn to aid. The sacrilege was absolute. They tore the precious relics from the altars of the Hagia Sophia, stripping the gold and silver from the icons that had been the spiritual bedrock of the Greek world. They desecrated the holy sanctuaries, mocking the liturgy they once shared. Libraries containing the wisdom of antiquity were ransacked, and priceless artworks were smashed into oblivion. The wealth of an empire, centuries of accumulated splendor, was being shoveled into the holds of Venetian galleys. To the men of the West, it was the ultimate prize. To the people of the East, it was the end of the world. As the smoke rose over the burning skyline, the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean was irrevocably shattered. The Crusaders did not leave as liberators, but as occupiers, carving up the Byzantine Empire into a patchwork of Latin territories, headed by a hollow puppet empire. But the true casualty was not the gold or the marble, it was the soul of the Christian world. The Great Schism, which had been a theological dispute between Rome and Constantinople since 1054, was now etched in blood. The betrayal of 1204 transformed a religious disagreement into a deep, visceral hatred that would endure for centuries. The bridge between East and West had not just been burned, it had been demolished. In their pursuit of the Holy Land, the Crusaders had inadvertently crippled the very empire that stood as the bulwark against the rising tides of the East. The Fourth Crusade had achieved the unthinkable. It had turned the cross against itself, leaving a wound in Christendom that would never truly heal. May 1204, the great palace of Constantinople, where once sat the Basileus, the sovereign of a thousand-year lineage, there now sat a collection of Frankish lords, clutching titles that felt increasingly like sand through their fingers. The Latin Empire of Constantinople had been born in the fires of sack and pillage, but as the smoke cleared, the grim reality of this new regime began to set in. It was a regime built on plunder, and plunder is a finite resource. The new emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, found himself the master of a ghost city. The immense wealth of the Byzantines had been spirited away to Venice and the counting houses of Europe, leaving the imperial treasury not just empty, but hollowed out. The Latin Empire was a crown without a head, a sprawling administrative nightmare that lacked the bureaucracy, the tax base, and most importantly, the legitimacy to rule. To the Greeks, these were not emperors. They were Latins, sacrilegious usurpers occupying their sacred halls. As the central authority in Constantinople withered, the dream of a unified Christian front in the East evaporated. In its place arose a chaotic patchwork of feudal lordships. The empire fragmented almost instantly into a mosaic of competing interests. The Duchy of Athens, the Lordship of Thessalonica, and various small, fortified outposts. These territories were often at odds with one another, more concerned with local skirmishes and Venetian maritime dominance than with the defense of Christendom. This fragmentation had a catastrophic ripple effect on the Crusader states in the Levant. For decades, the survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli had relied on the Byzantine Empire acting as a massive, stabilizing shield. The Byzantines provided the diplomatic weight, the logistical depth, and the secondary line of defense against the rising Islamic powers. With the Byzantine shield shattered into 1,000 pieces, the Crusader states were left naked. The bulwark of the East had been decapitated. The Latin Empire in Constantinople was too weak to project power southward, and the fragmented Greek successor states in Nicaea and Epirus were more interested in reclaiming their lost heritage than in sending aid to the outposts of Outremer. The Levant, once a series of fortified Christian enclaves, suddenly found itself isolated in a sea of rising hostility. The vacuum left by the collapse of Byzantine influence was rapidly filled by the renewed energies of the Muslim world. Without the shadow of Constantinople to deter them, local emirs and rising dynasties saw the Latin presence not as a formidable empire, but as a collection of disconnected, starving fortresses. The Latin Empire was a hollow victory in every sense of the word. It was a victory of greed over purpose, of conquest over continuity. By destroying the Byzantine Empire to satisfy the debts of a crusade, the Crusaders had inadvertently dismantled the very infrastructure required to sustain their presence in the East. They had won the city, but in doing so, they had lost the Levant. The Fourth Crusade had not paved the way to Jerusalem. It had paved the way to the inevitable collapse of the Latin East, ensuring that the era of the Crusader states would be defined not by expansion, but by a slow, agonizing retreat toward the sea. 1261, the walls of Constantinople. The city was reclaimed, the Greek banners were raised once more, and the Byzantine Empire breathed a shallow, desperate breath of life. But this was not the resurrection of an empire. It was the resuscitation of a corpse. The Fourth Crusade had not merely wounded the Byzantine state, it had fundamentally altered the tectonic plates of the medieval world, shifting the balance of power in ways that would resonate for centuries. The most immediate and irreversible consequence was the permanent fracture of Christendom. Before 1204, the Great Schism of 1054 was a theological dispute between elites, a rift in doctrine and liturgy that many believed could one day be mended through diplomacy. But the sack of Constantinople turned a religious disagreement into a blood feud. When the Latin Crusaders desecrated the Hagia Sophia, when they stripped the altars and turned churches into stables, they didn't just steal gold, they stole the possibility of reconciliation. To the Eastern Orthodox, the Latins were no longer misguided brothers. They were existential enemies. This wound became a permanent scar, ensuring that when the final existential threats to Europe arrived, the Christian East and West would remain divided, suspicious, and incapable of true unity. Beyond the spiritual, the Fourth Crusade fundamentally destabilized the geopolitical architecture of the Mediterranean. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had functioned as the indispensable buffer state. It was the Great Wall of Europe, absorbing the shock of migrations, nomadic invasions, and the expansion of Islamic caliphates. By dismantling this buffer, the Crusaders had inadvertently opened the gates. The fragmentation of the East created a power vacuum that the rising Ottoman Turks would eventually, and ruthlessly, fill. The very destruction of the Byzantine administrative and military machine meant that, when the crescent eventually met the cross, there was no organized imperial power left to stand in the way. Furthermore, the Crusades signaled a profound shift in the nature of the crusading movement itself. The idealistic fervor of the First Crusade, the Deus Vult, that drove men to march across continents for the salvation of their souls, had been replaced by a cold, mercantile pragmatism. The Fourth Crusade proved that the machinery of holy war could be hijacked by the interests of capital. The rise of the Venetian maritime empire, fueled by the plunder of Constantinople, demonstrated that the cross could be used as a cloak for the ledger book. The crusading impulse was no longer a purely religious phenomenon. It had become a tool of geopolitical maneuvering and economic expansion. As the centuries progressed, the legacy of 1204 became a cautionary tale written in the blood of the Levant and the ruins of the East. The Crusade, intended to secure the Holy Land for Christendom, had instead ensured its eventual loss. By destroying the shield of the East to satisfy the debts of the West, the Crusaders had set in motion a chain reaction of decline. The Fourth Crusade was the moment the movement lost its way, trading its spiritual North Star for the glittering, hollow promises of empire and gold. In their pursuit of a victory that served their greed, they had engineered the slow, inevitable sunset of the Crusader era. 1217, the ports of Europe. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of Constantinople, a new wave of religious fervor began to stir, attempting to reclaim the spiritual direction the movement had lost. If the Fourth Crusade was a descent into greed and betrayal, the Fifth Crusade was a desperate, calculated attempt at a strategic comeback. The crusading leadership had learned a bitter lesson. To hold Jerusalem, one had to control Egypt. The Ayyubid Sultanate, the successors to Saladin's legacy, sat firmly upon the Nile, and Egypt was the beating heart of Islamic power in the Levant. The Fifth Crusade, launched in the early 13th century, was characterized by a shift in military logic. This was no longer a disorganized march of peasants. It was a maritime-focused campaign, heavily reliant on the logistical might of the Italian city-states. The Crusaders landed at Damietta, a vital port on the Nile Delta, and for a time it seemed as though the tide might finally turn. They captured the city, establishing a foothold that would serve as their base of operations. However, the campaign soon became a masterclass in the dangers of strategic overreach and internal discord. The crusading commanders found themselves trapped in a grueling war of attrition against the Mamluks and Ayyubid forces. They struggled with the complexities of Egyptian geography, the unpredictable flooding of the Nile, and perhaps most fatally, a profound lack of unified command. While some argued for a cautious approach to consolidate their gains, others pushed for a direct, aggressive march toward Cairo. This indecision bled the army of its momentum. After years of stalemate, disease, and mounting costs, the Fifth Crusade collapsed. The dream of decapitating the Ayyubid power structure through the conquest of Egypt vanished, leaving the Crusader states more vulnerable than ever. Yet the pendulum of history was about to swing in a direction no one expected. As the Fifth Crusade faltered through blood and iron, a new figure emerged who would redefine the very concept of holy war: Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. 1228, the shores of Jaffa. The Sixth Crusade stands in stark, almost surreal contrast to the bloody failures that preceded it. While the Fifth Crusade was defined by the clash of steel, the Sixth was defined by the clash of wits. Frederick II was a man of his time, a polyglot, a scholar, and a ruler who viewed the world through the lens of Mediterranean politics rather than pure religious zeal. He was excommunicated by the Pope, viewed with suspicion by the very church he was sent to defend. Yet he possessed a diplomatic sophistication that no king before him had mastered. Instead of launching a massive, doomed invasion, Frederick engaged in high-stakes diplomacy with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil. In a series of tense negotiations, Frederick bypassed the battlefield entirely. Through treaties and concessions, he secured the peaceful return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control. It was a victory of the pen rather than the sword, a diplomatic crusade that stunned the Christian world. To some, Frederick was a hero who had achieved the impossible. To others, he was a heretic who had bartered with the enemy. Regardless of the judgment, the Sixth Crusade proved that the era of the grand, idealistic conquest was fading, replaced by a complex, cynical world where treaties were often more effective than crusades. 1229, The Palace of Al-Kamil. To understand how a man branded a heretic by the Pope could achieve what the greatest warrior kings of Europe could not, one must look beyond the battlefield and into the corridors of power. Frederick II was not a traditional crusader. He was a Hohenstaufen emperor, a ruler of Sicily and Germany, and a man whose intellect was as sharp as any knight's blade. While his predecessors had sought to crush the Islamic world under a tide of iron, Frederick understood that the Levant was not a vacuum to be filled, but a complex web of shifting loyalties, ancient bloodlines, and economic necessities. The stage for this unprecedented diplomatic maneuver was set by a shared crisis. The Ayyubid Empire, the successor state to Saladin, was fracturing. Sultan al-Kamil found himself caught between the rising threat of his own Mamluk subordinates and the external pressure of the Christian presence. He did not want a war of annihilation. He wanted stability. Frederick, meanwhile, was an outcast. Excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, he arrived in the Holy Land not with the blessing of the Church, but with the sheer political weight of his imperial title. The negotiations that followed were a masterclass in geopolitical pragmatism. Unlike the Crusaders of old, who demanded unconditional surrender in the name of Christ, Frederick and Al-Kamil met as equals. They spoke the language of realpolitik. They negotiated not just over theology, but over trade routes, maritime access, and the delicate balance of power in the Mediterranean. Through a series of intense, often tense exchanges, the Treaty of Jaffa was forged. The terms were staggering in their audacity. Jerusalem, the very jewel of the Christian world, was to be returned to the Crusaders. Bethlehem and Nazareth would follow. However, there was a crucial caveat. The holy places within Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, would remain under Muslim control. It was a compromise that prioritized presence over absolute sovereignty, a practical solution to an impossible religious demand. When the news reached Europe, the reaction was nothing short of explosive. To the pious and the militant, Frederick's success felt like a betrayal. They saw a man who had bargained with the infidel, a ruler who had traded the glory of a holy conquest for the convenience of a signed parchment. The Church viewed his methods as a mockery of the crusading ideal, arguing that the Holy Land could only be won through divine intervention and the shedding of blood, not through the ink of a diplomat. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. For the first time in decades, the Latin East breathed a sigh of relief. The borders were stabilized, and the terrifying prospect of an immediate, massive Islamic reconquest was temporarily pushed at bay. Frederick II had achieved the unthinkable. He had reclaimed the Holy City without a single major siege, without a massacre of civilians, and without the loss of a single legion. The Sixth Crusade remains one of history's great paradoxes. It was a crusade that succeeded by refusing to fight, a holy war conducted through secular means. It signaled a profound shift in the crusading movement, a transition from the era of religious fervor and unstoppable momentum to an era of calculated, cynical, and highly sophisticated statecraft. The sword had been laid down, and in its place, the treaty had been picked up. 1248, the Royal Courts of France. If Frederick II's crusade was a triumph of the mind, the Seventh Crusade would be a testament to the unyielding, almost fanatical devotion of the soul. For the papacy and the militant nobility of Europe, the Treaty of Jaffa was an affront, a hollow peace that left the Holy Sepulchre under the shadow of the Crescent. They did not want diplomacy. They wanted a crusade that would finish what the first had started. And they found their champion in Louis IX, the Capetian King of France. Louis was not a cynical diplomat or a calculating emperor. He was a man of profound, almost terrifying piety. To Louis, the crusading ideal was not a political tool but a divine mandate. He viewed the reclamation of the Holy Land as a personal mission of penance and righteousness. When he took the cross, he did not merely prepare an army, he prepared a pilgrimage of iron. The strategy for this new campaign was fundamentally different from those of the past. The Crusaders realized that the Latin East was a fragile limb, easily severed. To strike at the heart of the Levant, one had to strike at its powerhouse, Egypt. The Ayyubid dynasty, though fracturing, still controlled the wealth and the grain of the Nile. If Egypt fell, the Holy Land would follow. In 1248, a massive Christian armada set sail, carrying the flower of French chivalry. The scale of the expedition was staggering, a logistical undertaking that reflected the immense wealth and organized power of the French monarchy. But the Mediterranean is a fickle mistress, and the journey was fraught with hardship. When the fleet finally arrived on the shores of Damietta, the gateway to the Nile, the Crusaders felt the momentum of divine favor. They took Damietta with relative ease, and for a moment it seemed that Louis might achieve the impossible. But the Egyptian defense was not the disorganized rabble the Crusaders expected. They were facing a sophisticated military machine, and more importantly, they were facing the rising tide of the Mamluks, the elite warrior slaves who were rapidly becoming the true masters of Egypt. The campaign soon spiraled from a conquest into a nightmare of attrition. As the French pushed deeper into the Nile Delta, the environment itself became an enemy. The heat was oppressive, the terrain was treacherous, and the Egyptian scorched-earth tactics left the Crusaders starving and thirsty. The Nile, once seen as a lifeline, became a barrier of mud and fever. The climax of this tragedy unfolded at Mansoura. Caught in the labyrinthine waterways and facing the ferocious, disciplined charge of the Mamluk cavalry, the French army was broken. The once mighty host of Louis IX was decimated, not just by the sword, but by disease and exhaustion. The King of France, the man who sought to embody the holiness of the crusade, found himself a prisoner of his enemies. The Seventh Crusade ended not with a glorious conquest, but with a humiliating ransom. Louis was forced to surrender Damietta and pay a king's ransom to secure his release. It was a crushing blow to the crusading movement. The era of the great kings was fading, and as the Mamluks consolidated their power in the wake of the French defeat, the shadow of an unstoppable Islamic resurgence began to loom over the Levant, signaling the beginning of the end for the Crusader states. 1250, the streets of Cairo. The defeat of Louis IX at Mansoura was more than a military catastrophe. It was a political earthquake that shattered the foundations of the Ayyubid dynasty. For generations, the Ayyubids, the descendants of Saladin, had ruled Egypt through a delicate balance of family lineage and military might. But as the dust settled over the blood-soaked delta, it became clear that the true architects of Egypt's survival were not the princes of the royal bloodline, but the men who had held the line at Mansoura, the Mamluks. To understand the rise of the Mamluk shadow, one must understand the paradox of their existence. The word Mamluk literally means owned. They were a caste of warrior slaves, primarily of Turkic origin, purchased as children from the Eurasian steppes and brought to the Nile. They were stripped of their pasts, converted to Islam, and forged in a brutal, specialized military system. From the moment they could hold a bow or a mace, their entire lives were dedicated to the art of war. They were not mere soldiers. They were a professional military elite, bred for discipline, loyalty to their commanders, and a lethal proficiency in cavalry warfare. For decades, the Ayyubid sultans had used these Mamluks as a praetorian guard, a way to ensure they had a loyal force that owed no allegiance to local Egyptian factions or rival princely families. But the Mamluks had become too efficient, too numerous, and too indispensable. They had realized a fundamental truth. The kings they protected were increasingly fragile, while the warriors they commanded were invincible. The vacuum left by the Seventh Crusade provided the perfect opportunity for a coup. In the chaos following the French retreat, the Mamluk factions turned on their masters. The Ayyubid Sultanship, once the symbol of legitimacy in the Islamic world, was swept aside by the very men who had defended its borders. In a swift, violent transition of power, the Mamluks seized the throne. They did not merely want to serve the state, they intended to be the state. This was a radical departure from the traditional Islamic models of governance. Instead of a hereditary dynasty, Egypt was now ruled by a military oligarchy, a meritocracy of the sword. Power shifted between different Mamluk factions, often decided by the edge of a blade in the streets of Cairo. Yet, despite the internal volatility, this new regime possessed a singular, terrifying focus: the total eradication of the Crusader presence in the Levant. The Mamluks were not interested in the nuanced diplomacy of Frederick II or the fragile truces of the earlier eras. They were a caste defined by struggle. To them, the existence of the Latin East was an affront to the unity of the Dar al-Islam. Having consolidated their grip on Egypt, they turned their eyes northward toward the coastal strongholds of the Crusaders. As the Mamluk shadow lengthened across the Mediterranean, the Crusader states realized they were no longer fighting the fractured remnants of an old empire. They were facing a unified, professional, and relentless military machine. The era of the knight tyrant was meeting the era of the professional warrior slave, and the outcome was already being written in the sand. May 1291, the city of Acre. For over a century, Acre had served as the beating heart of the Latin East. It was a city of marble, commerce, and desperate hope, the last great bastion of the Crusader presence in the Levant. But as the spring sun rose over the Mediterranean, the city did not see the arrival of merchant galleys or pilgrims. Instead, it saw the horizon darken with the dust of a massive, unstoppable juggernaut. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Ashraf Khalil, had arrived. He did not come with a mere raiding party, but with the full, concentrated fury of the Mamluk Sultanate. His army was a terrifying assembly of professional warriors, thousands of heavy cavalry, specialized siege engineers, and an overwhelming numbers of infantry, all unified by a single, uncompromising objective: the total expulsion of the Frankish presence from the Holy Land. The siege began with a thunderous intensity that the defenders of Acre could scarcely have imagined. The Mamluks deployed a terrifying array of siege engines, massive trebuchets and catapults that rained stones and fire upon the city's formidable walls. For days, the air was filled with the whistling of projectiles and the screams of the dying. The defenders, a mix of local knights, urban militias, and the elite remnants of the military orders, fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were standing on the edge of an abyss. The Templars and the Hospitallers, once the undisputed masters of the battlefield, now found themselves relegated to the role of desperate defenders of crumbling ramparts. They fought not for conquest, but for survival, holding narrow streets and fortified towers against waves of Mamluk assaults. But the sheer weight of the Mamluk machine was too much. Their siege engines systematically dismantled the outer defenses, creating breaches that the Sultan's disciplined infantry poured through like a tide. By mid-May, the situation within Acre had turned catastrophic. The city was a landscape of fire and ruin. As the walls gave way, the fighting moved from the battlements into the narrow, suffocating labyrinth of the streets. It was hand-to-hand, visceral, and unrelenting. The Mamluks, driven by a religious and political mandate to cleanse the coast, showed no mercy. In the final, frantic hours, the evacuation of the city became a scene of pure chaos. The few remaining Christian vessels in the harbor struggled to take on refugees amidst the carnage. Many were lost to the sea, others were cut down on the docks. As the Templar fortress, the last organized pocket of resistance, finally succumbed to the onslaught, the realization set in: the Latin East was gone. The fall of Acre was not merely the loss of a city, it was the death knell of a dream. The coastal strongholds that had sustained the Crusader states for nearly 2 centuries vanished in a matter of weeks. With Acre gone, the remaining outposts, Tyre, Sidon, and Tortosa, were nothing more than isolated islands in a Mamluk sea, soon to be swallowed. The era of the Crusader states had reached its violent, definitive conclusion. The Levant, once a patchwork of Latin kingdoms, was once again firmly under Islamic control. The shadow of the Mamluks had finally eclipsed the cross, leaving behind only the ruins of castles and the echoes of a failed crusade. May 1291, the shores of the Levant. The smoke from the ruins of Acre had barely cleared before the reality of the situation settled over the remaining Christian outposts like a funerary shroud. The fall of the city was not a temporary setback. It was a systemic collapse. The dominoes had begun to fall. With the loss of their primary commercial hub and their most formidable defensive bastion, the remaining Latin strongholds, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, found themselves utterly isolated. They were no longer part of a burgeoning kingdom. They were merely stranded casualties of a retreating tide. As the Mamluk Sultanate consolidated its grip on the coast, the retreat of the Latin East transitioned from a frantic flight to a desperate, organized exodus. The Crusader presence, which had once sought to reshape the Levant in the image of Western feudalism, was now being forcibly erased. This was the twilight of Outremer. The knights, the merchants, and the common pilgrims who had once dreamed of a permanent Christian Levant were now looking toward the horizon, not with hope, but with the grim necessity of survival. In the final months of 1291, the remaining garrisons of the military orders faced a harrowing choice: die in a hopeless defense or abandon the lands they had bled for over 2 centuries. The Templars and the Hospitallers, the very backbone of the crusading movement, found themselves presiding over a ghost empire. They retreated to the last few coastal fortresses, watching as the vast inland territories they had once claimed were reclaimed by the Mamluks with clinical efficiency. The retreat was a logistical nightmare and a psychological catastrophe. Thousands of refugees crowded onto the few remaining Venetian and Genoese ships, fleeing a land that had become an alien landscape to them. For many, the departure was a moment of profound spiritual crisis. They had come to these shores as soldiers of Christ, believing they were part of a divine mission that would endure for eternity. To leave was to admit that the dream of a Latin Jerusalem was, perhaps, a beautiful, violent illusion. As the last ships cleared the harbors, the landscape of the Levant underwent a fundamental transformation. The great stone castles, the cracked des Chevaliers, the massive fortifications of Antioch and Tripoli remained, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer the outposts of a new western frontier. They were relics of a failed intrusion. The Mamluks, recognizing the strategic value of these structures, repurposed them, turning the very tools of Christian occupation into the bulwarks of Islamic hegemony. The retreat of the Latin East signaled the end of the era of organized, large-scale crusading as a territorial endeavor. While the impulse for holy war would continue to flicker in Europe for centuries, the era of the Crusader states, the era of permanent, landed Frankish kingdoms in the Middle East, was over. The Levant had closed its doors to the West. The cross had been pulled from the soil, leaving behind a legacy of profound cultural exchange, deep-seated religious scars, and a geopolitical map that would be redrawn by the victors of the desert. The age of the Crusader had passed, leaving only the silence of the ruins and the long, echoing memory of a struggle that had changed the world forever. Late 13th century, the ports of Europe and the libraries of the Mediterranean. While the physical presence of the Crusader states was being systematically erased from the Levanten coastline, something far more subtle, and perhaps far more permanent, was occurring. The swords were being sheathed, and the banners of the cross were being lowered, but the minds of the men who had traveled these routes were returning home laden with more than just memories of defeat. They were carrying something that would ignite a transformation in the West, the intellectual treasures of the Islamic Golden Age. To understand the scale of this exchange, one must recognize the staggering disparity that existed between the two worlds. While Europe had spent much of the early Middle Ages in a period of localized, agrarian survival, the Islamic world had become the global custodian of human knowledge. From Baghdad to Cairo, and through the vibrant centers of Andalusia, Muslim scholars had not only preserved the wisdom of the ancients, but had expanded upon it with breathtaking sophistication. As the Crusades facilitated constant, albeit violent, contact between East and West, a trickle of knowledge began to flow back across the Mediterranean. This was not merely a movement of goods like silk or spices, but a profound transfusion of ideas. In the realm of medicine, the European understanding of the human body was primitive, often mired in superstition. However, through the contact points of the Levant and the translation movements in Spain, the works of great Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Al-Razi began to permeate European universities. The concept of hospitals as centers for healing, the systematic use of pharmacology, and advanced surgical techniques, all of which had been refined in the sophisticated medical centers of the East, began to reshape Western practice, laying the groundwork for the medical revolutions of the Renaissance. Science and mathematics underwent an even more radical metamorphosis. The Crusaders and the merchants who followed them brought back the concept of Arabic numerals, including the revolutionary idea of zero. This replaced the cumbersome Roman numeral system, providing the essential mathematical language required for complex commerce and, eventually, modern physics. Along with this came advancements in optics, astronomy, and the refinement of the astrolabe, tools that would eventually allow European explorers to navigate the vast, uncharted oceans. Perhaps most significantly, this era saw the reintroduction of classical philosophy. For centuries, much of the Greek intellectual tradition, the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy, had been lost to the Latin West, but these texts had been meticulously preserved, translated, and commented upon by Muslim scholars. As these works filtered back into Europe through the conduits of the Crusader era and the broader Mediterranean trade, they sparked a philosophical awakening. The marriage of faith and reason, a central theme in Islamic scholarship, challenged European thinkers to reconcile theology with logic. The Crusades were, undeniably, a period of brutal conflict and religious intolerance. Yet, in the shadow of the battlefield, a bridge was built of parchment and ink. The very civilizations that sought to destroy one another inadvertently facilitated a collision of intellects. The flow of science, medicine, and philosophy did not just supplement European knowledge. It fundamentally rewired the Western mind, providing the intellectual fuel that would eventually pull Europe out of the Middle Ages and propel it toward the modern era. 1291. The bustling docks of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. If the movement of ideas was the intellectual transfusion of the crusading era, then the movement of capital was its lifeblood. While the scholars were translating Aristotle and the physicians were studying Avicenna, a different class of men was quietly rewriting the economic destiny of Europe. These were not knights or monks, but merchants, men whose primary allegiance was not to a cross or a caliph, but to the ledger and the sea. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a fragmented frontier, a barrier between the isolated kingdoms of Europe and the wealthy, interconnected networks of the East. But the Crusades fundamentally altered this geography. The constant demand for logistics, the need to transport thousands of troops, horses, and supplies to the Levant, created a massive, unprecedented market for maritime services. This demand acted as a catalyst, transforming the small, coastal settlements of Italy into the most powerful maritime republics the world had ever seen. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa did not merely participate in the Crusades, they became their indispensable engine. As the Latin East established its foothold, these Italian city-states recognized a golden opportunity. They provided the ships, the sailors, and the naval protection required to keep the Crusader states alive. In return, they demanded more than just gold. They demanded commercial privileges, tax exemptions, and the establishment of permanent trading colonies in the very heart of the Levant. By securing these quarters in cities like Acre, Tyre, and Antioch, the Italian merchants bypassed the middleman. They established a direct pipeline from the Silk Road to the European markets. The luxury goods that had once been the exclusive domain of Eastern royalty, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and silk, began to flow steadily into the ports of the Mediterranean. The scent of the Orient was no longer a distant myth. It was becoming a tangible reality in the markets of Europe. This influx of goods necessitated a revolution in how money was handled. The sheer volume of trade, coupled with the massive costs of funding holy wars, demanded more sophisticated financial instruments. We see here the early stirrings of modern capitalism, the development of sophisticated banking systems, the use of letters of credit to avoid the risks of carrying heavy bullion, and the birth of maritime insurance. The Knights Templar, in their role as protectors of pilgrims, had already pioneered a rudimentary form of international banking. But it was the Italian merchants who refined these tools into a system that could sustain global commerce. The wealth generated by this trade did not just enrich individual families, it fundamentally shifted the center of gravity in Europe. The Mediterranean became a bustling highway of exchange, a liquid border where the wealth of the East met the growing appetite of the West. This economic boom fueled the rise of a new urban middle class, a class whose power was built on commerce rather than land ownership. Ultimately, the Crusades achieved a paradox. While the military campaigns often ended in territorial loss and strategic retreat, the economic momentum they unleashed was irreversible. The Italian maritime republics had bridged the gap between two worlds, weaving the East and West into a single, complex web of dependency. The Crusades may have failed to secure the Holy Land for Christendom, but they succeeded in securing the Mediterranean for commerce, setting the stage for the commercial revolution that would eventually fund the Renaissance and launch the Age of Discovery. 1096, the Rhine Valley, Germany. While the Italian merchants were busy weaving the threads of a new global economy, a much darker, more visceral current was surging through the veins of Europe. If the Crusade was, in its ideal form, a journey toward the Holy Sepulchre, in its reality, it often became a journey of unchecked bloodlust, a phenomenon that turned the fervor of faith into a weapon of domestic terror. The tragedy began long before the first night reached the shores of Anatolia. As the call to arms echoed from the pulpits of Europe, it triggered a wave of populist violence that the organized military campaigns could not contain. This was the era of the People's Crusade, but it was also the era of the first great pogroms. To many of the untrained, zealously religious masses, the concept of a holy war against non-believers abroad sparked a lethal logic. If the enemy was the infidel in the East, then the enemy must also be found within the borders of Christendom. The primary targets of this redirected rage were the Jewish communities of Europe. For centuries, these communities had lived as a distinct, often vital, part of the European social fabric. But as the crusading spirit ignited, the Jewish people were recast as the internal other. In the Rhineland, in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, the unthinkable happened. Driven by a toxic cocktail of religious fanaticism, economic resentment, and the belief that they were purging the world of sin, mobs of crusaders turned upon their neighbors. Massacres erupted with terrifying speed. Families were slaughtered in their homes. Entire communities were burned alive in their synagogues. For many Jewish citizens, the choice was a horrific one: forced conversion to Christianity or death. This was not merely collateral damage of war. It was a systematic, violent redirection of religious zeal that left a permanent scar on the Jewish diaspora and fundamentally altered the relationship between the Church and its Jewish subjects for centuries to come. This internal violence was not limited to the persecution of minorities. The very structure of European society began to fracture under the weight of the crusading ideal. The concept of holy violence created a dangerous precedent. It suggested that killing in the name of God was not only permissible but meritorious. This mindset bled into the internal politics of Europe, fueling vendettas, land grabs, and local wars that were often cloaked in the language of piety. The distinction between a soldier of Christ and a common marauder became increasingly blurred. As we look back, we must recognize that the crusade was never a monolith of singular purpose. While the merchants were building the foundations of the modern world through trade and banking, the crusading impulse was simultaneously tearing at the social and moral fabric of Europe. The same energy that fueled the expansion of trade and the exchange of ideas also fueled a dark, exclusionary nationalism. The crusade did more than just bridge the gap between East and West. It created deep, enduring fractures within the West itself, leaving behind a legacy of intolerance and violence that would haunt the European conscience long after the last crusader had laid down his sword. 19th century, London, England. As the smoke of the Industrial Revolution billowed across the skyline, a new kind of battleground emerged, not in the Levant but in the halls of literature, art, and academia. To understand the Crusades today, we must first understand the lens through which we have been taught to view them. For centuries, the Crusades have been trapped between two opposing extremes: the sanitized romanticism of the Victorian era and the modern tendency to view them solely through a lens of reactionary politics. In the 1800s, the Crusades were reborn through the Romantic imagination. Writers like Sir Walter Scott and various epic poets reimagined the era as a grand, chivalric adventure. They painted a world of glittering plate armor, noble knights following strict codes of honor, and a certain clash of civilizations that possessed a tragic, poetic beauty. In this version of history, the Crusades were a playground for heroes like Richard the Lionheart, larger-than-life figures whose personal nobility transcended the grim, muddy reality of medieval warfare. This romanticization stripped the Crusades of their most brutal elements: the starvation, the disease, the political treachery, and the crushing religious fanaticism that drove men to madness. It turned a complex, multi-sided geopolitical struggle into a simplified morality play of good versus evil. However, as we moved into the 20th and 21st centuries, the pendulum swung violently in the other direction. In an effort to deconstruct the Romantic myths, history was often flattened into a singular narrative of unprovoked Western aggression. While it is true that the Crusades involved immense violence and religious intolerance, the reductionist view often ignores the nuance of the era. It overlooks the fact that the movement was a response to centuries of Islamic expansion and the desperate pleas of the Byzantine Empire. By viewing the Crusades purely as a precursor to modern imperialism, we risk committing a historical fallacy, anachronism, where we project modern political motivations onto medieval actors who were driven by a completely different cosmic worldview. The danger of these distorted narratives is that they prevent us from seeing the Crusades for what they actually were: a chaotic, multifaceted phenomenon that defied easy categorization. The Crusades were not just a series of holy wars. They were economic migrations. They were political power plays by ambitious popes and kings. And they were profound, often misguided, expressions of deep-seated spiritual anxiety. When we rely on the chivalric myth, we ignore the suffering of the marginalized. When we rely on the aggression myth, we ignore the complex agency of the actors involved. To truly study this era, we must strip away the layers of romanticized legend and the heavy-handed political allegories that have been draped over it. We must move past the stained glass windows of the Victorian poets and the heated rhetoric of modern pundits. Only by confronting the unvarnished, uncomfortable truth, a truth that is neither purely heroic nor purely villainous, can we begin to understand how this medieval impulse fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of human civilization. 21st century, Jerusalem. Here in the narrow, winding alleys of the old city, the past does not feel like history. It feels like a living, breathing presence. To the casual observer, the tensions in the Levant are a product of modern borders, post-colonial disputes, and the struggle for national sovereignty. But beneath the surface of contemporary diplomacy lies a deep, psychological substrate, a historical memory that stretches back to the clashing steel of the 11th century. The Crusades have transitioned from a historical era into a powerful political metaphor. In the modern Middle East, the term crusader is rarely used to describe medieval knights. Instead, it is weaponized as a potent rhetorical tool. When political leaders in the region speak of crusader aggression or Western crusading mentalities, They are not merely referencing the past. They are invoking a collective trauma. They are drawing a direct line from the siege engines of the 1090s to the modern interventions of global superpowers. In this context, the Crusades serves as a shorthand for any perceived Western intrusion into Islamic lands, casting modern geopolitical maneuvers as part of a thousand-year-old pattern of religious conquest. This creates a cycle of perception that is incredibly difficult to break. For many in the Muslim world, the historical memory of the Crusader states, those Latin enclaves that existed as foreign outposts in a sea of Islamic territory, serves as a cautionary archetype. It fuels a profound skepticism toward foreign military presence and international peacekeeping efforts, which can be interpreted through the lens of neo-Crusadism. When Western powers intervene in the Levant, the specter of the Frankish knight is often summoned to frame the conflict not as a struggle over resources or security, but as an existential assault on the faith and the soil. Conversely, the legacy of the Crusades also shapes how the West perceives the Middle East. The romanticized, chivalric imagery of the Middle Ages has occasionally bled into modern foreign policy, fostering a civilizing mission mindset that echoes the paternalism of the colonial era. This creates a dangerous feedback loop, a West that views its involvement through a lens of moral guardianship, and a Middle East that views that same involvement as an ancient, predestined crusade. The tragedy of these geopolitical echoes is that they often obscure the actual material causes of modern conflict. The complexities of water rights, land ownership, sectarian divides, and economic instability are frequently drowned out by the thunderous, emotive rhetoric of holy war. When history is used as a weapon, it ceases to be a tool for understanding and becomes a barrier to peace. To navigate the modern Middle East, one must recognize that we are not just dealing with modern states, but with the ghosts of the Crusader era. The scars left by the fall of Acre and the siege of Jerusalem have been passed down through generations, embedded in the cultural consciousness. Understanding these echoes does not mean we must accept them as destiny, but we must acknowledge them as reality. We cannot resolve the conflicts of the present if we remain blind to the historical shadows that continue to dictate the movements of men and the destinies of nations. 2024, London. As the dust of centuries settles and the grand narratives of kings, popes, and caliphs fade into the archives of history, we are left to ask, what truly was the cost of this era of holy war? To look back on the Crusades is not merely to study a series of military campaigns, but to examine the fundamental volatility of human conviction when it is fused with the machinery of state power. The first and perhaps most harrowing lesson is the danger of the sacred justification. The Crusades demonstrated how easily the complexities of politics, land, and greed can be cloaked in the infallible language of divine will. When a conflict is framed as a struggle between good and evil, between God and the infidel, the traditional rules of diplomacy, mercy, and compromise are discarded. In such an environment, there is no room for the middle ground. There is only total victory or total annihilation. We see in the Crusades a warning of what happens when human ambition hijacks the pulpit, turning faith into a catalyst for carnage rather than a source of peace. Secondly, the Crusades teach us about the profound fragility of cultural coexistence. The Latin East was, for a time, a place of incredible synthesis, a frontier where East met West, where science flowed, and where trade bridged divides. Yet this coexistence was often superficial, built on the precarious foundations of occupation and suspicion. The history of the Crusades reminds us that true stability cannot be achieved through the imposition of one culture upon another through the sword. Lasting peace requires more than just a treaty or a cessation of hostilities. It requires the recognition of the other as a legitimate inhabitant of the land, rather than a mere obstacle to be overcome. Furthermore, we must confront the lesson of the unintended consequence. The Crusaders set out to secure the Holy Land, yet in doing so, they inadvertently forged the very forces that would eventually expel them. By threatening the unity of the Islamic world, the Crusades acted as a crucible, accelerating the rise of powerful, centralized leaders like Saladin and the Mamluks, and hardening the resolve of a fractured religious landscape. History shows us that violence rarely achieves its stated goals. Instead, it often creates new, more formidable adversaries and shifts the tectonic plates of power in ways that the original instigators could never have predicted. Finally, the Crusades leave us with a lesson on the persistence of memory. We have seen that history is never truly dead. It lives in the songs, the scriptures, and the political rhetoric of the present. The ghosts we discussed earlier, the trauma of the sack of Constantinople or the memory of the fall of Acre, are not just footnotes. They are active participants in modern identity. As we close this chapter of human history, we realize that the Crusades were not an isolated madness of the Middle Ages, but a profound demonstration of the human condition. They stand as a testament to our capacity for incredible devotion and terrible cruelty, for brilliant intellectual exchange and senseless destruction. If we are to learn anything from these centuries of holy war, it is that, while faith can move mountains, it is our capacity for empathy, nuance, and diplomacy that must prevent those mountains from falling upon us all.